The purpose of this is to give you a bit of an explanation of how to read Hamlet intertextually in light of your reading of Albert Camus' The Outsider. So our learning intentions are to understand the concept of intertextuality and to be able to apply this to your concept of your reading of Hamlet and The Outsider. So this definition is quite lengthy, but there's a couple of parts of this that I want to draw your attention to. Firstly, intertextuality is about making connections between texts, and there are all kinds of connections you can make between texts. It can be based on genre, language, formal style. It could be on the ideologies or in terms of plots, characters, or themes. And the key part to this is this idea of resonances. Just as in physics, the idea of resonance is where something makes a sound and vibrates and makes something else nearby vibrate, so it is with literature. Our reading of one text can resonate with our reading of another. And that word resonance is something that can be really helpful to your understanding of intertextuality. Think about how this might apply to Hamlet. So initially, we can think about Hamlet first and foremost as a tragedy. More specifically, it's a revenge tragedy. It's a work of Shakespearean theatre. It's a representation of the context of the Renaissance, the English Renaissance, that is. But we could also look at it in terms of its representations of women and women across looking at other Shakespearean texts as well. But these are the things we can see in Hamlet. There are many other things, but here's a sample. So we could then look at how we might interpret Hamlet, or how we could think about Hamlet in terms of our reading of Othello. So first of all, we could look at them both as tragedies and think about the downfall of the noble hero and evaluate the downfall of Hamlet as compared to that of Othello. More interestingly for me, the representation of women in Shakespeare works with Othello as well as other texts from the period, such as Romeo and Juliet. In Othello and Romeo and Juliet, we have women as property, as parts of the economic life of the period. But also we could look at Hamlet as a work of Shakespearean theatre and read it intertextually with Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. Moreover, we could think of Hamlet purely as a tragedy and then evaluate it with ancient Greek theatre, specifically Oedipus. And we could ask ourselves, does Oedipus and Othello have more in common with each other? Or does Othello and Hamlet have more in common? Or indeed, Hamlet and Oedipus? It's a really interesting way we can think about the text to compare them. What I mean here is that Othello and Oedipus have a lot in common, where the hamartia of the tragic hero is about their lack of knowledge. Othello is kind of seduced by the stories of Iago, whereas Oedipus doesn't know that his wife is actually his mother. However, Hamlet and Oedipus have more in common because they are royalty, and so therefore their downfall might be considered of greater magnitude than the downfall of Othello, perhaps. Interesting things we can do with that. So the kinds of readings we might then arrive at, the kinds of readings that could be activated from these intertextual readings would include the acceptance of fate, how women were placed in English Renaissance society, the nature of political power, how tragedies work to evoke catharsis in the audience. But we might look at Hamlet in terms of some of the ideas we see in it. Hamlet could be regarded as a meditation on death, about finding meaning in life, dealing with grief. It's a play about existential torment. Now, a student did ask me what's the difference between finding meaning in life and existential torment, or even a meditation on death. I just like the sound of existential torment. Just kind of sounds intellectual, I guess. Now, how can we compare this with The Outsider? How can we read it intertextually? Same ideas are found in The Outsider by Albert Camus. We can see it as a meditation on death, about finding meaning in life, about dealing with grief, about existential torment. We could consider the two and then read them together. Now, for this part of this video, you won't be able to necessarily have access to the document that was with this. This was given to my class. But I'm going to give you a bit of an outline of how we might approach an intertextual reading of Hamlet and the outsider. The thesis I'm going to offer is this. By reading Hamlet intertextually with the outsider, we can see the young prince as a proto-Meursault, struggling with the meaning of life, asking life's most fundamental question, to be or not to be. So that is going to be my thesis. That's my argument for my whole essay. If I was writing this into an essay, I would have this as the final sentence in my introduction as a way of making sure that I have a clear argument that is about an intertextual reading of Hamlet with the outsider. I'm also thinking of this in the context of a WA ATAR literature exam. And so for this one, I'm going to be having Hamlet, my drama, as my primary text. So I'm thinking of this essay with the idea that drama is the primary text, and I'm doing an intertextual reading of Hamlet. Now, this word proposition might be a new one to you. A lot of the time in English we talk about topic sentences and topics, and an observation I've had over the years is that students, when they talk about topics, end up talking about a part of a novel or part of a play. My first topic is going to be Act 3. So what I'd rather do is actually think about paragraphs as, rather than being topics, they're about propositions that are being made. So you have your thesis, and that thesis will be supported by 3 or 4 propositions that you'll make, that you'll support with evidence. So my first proposition is that both Hamlet and the outsider need to be understood in terms of their protagonist's struggle with meaning. Bit clumsy, but it'll work. Now I'm going to be thinking about this paragraph as a bit of a synopsis paragraph in many ways, because as part of my exam and part of my essay, I need to just give a little bit of an overview of each of the texts. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a brief synopsis, but with close attention to each text being about a struggle for meaning. I mean, Hamlet's 5 acts long. I mean, a proper synopsis would take an entire essay. So in my essay, I'm just going to give a brief synopsis of Hamlet, only in as much as it's about being a struggle for meaning, and likewise for Camus' The Outsider, and in that I'll be talking about it being the narrative expression of Camus' philosophy of the absurd. My second proposition is that Prince Hamlet can be read as a precursor to Meursault because of his intellectual rather than his spiritual connection to the universe. There's a typo in this, but I'm sure you'll forgive me. His intellectual rather than his spiritual connection to the universe. So the supporting details for this, I will be using these quotes. The "what a piece of work is man," it's not a soliloquy, but when Hamlet talks about that, and talking about people being the quintessence of dust. I'll be interested in the opening lines of Camus, and I'll be looking at how both approach life with a bit of a sense of futility. Hamlet sees human beings as the quintessence of dust, yet, and also Meursault uses this matter-of-fact tone to describe or to account for the death of his mother. Now, these notes here are kind of notes to self that I might use in exam. So I'm modeling how I start with a proposition and then have ideas for what I would use to support that. My third proposition is this. Throughout Shakespeare's play and Camus' novel, death is ever present, whether through the grief of a recently dead parent, the contemplation of the afterlife, actual murder, or the inevitability of the protagonist's own demise. An intertextual reading on these terms forces us to contemplate our own mortality. Again, there's a typo in there, a bit frustrated with myself, but I'm going to move on. One of the things that's interesting with both of these texts is that they both begin with the death of a parent. They both have a climax that involves the protagonist murdering somebody, and their deaths become inevitable. And then it's about how they manage that and how they approach that inevitability that I find interesting. So to support this, I'll be talking about how, while Meursault is indifferent, Hamlet is consumed by grief. I'm going to analyse the that this too solid flesh would melt thaw and resolve itself into a dew soliloquy, with a specific also reference to the unweeded garden that Hamlet talks about. This paragraph will mostly be about Hamlet because the essay is using Hamlet as its primary text. My fourth proposition is that the key that links these two worldviews about death is the question of the afterlife. So the support for that is the to be or not to be soliloquy and this idea that conscience does make cowards of us all. There's the quote, "I may look as if I had nothing," from I think it's like the fourth last page of The Outsider. And so what I'm linking together here is that while Hamlet says that the only thing that stops people from ending it all is their conscience and their fear of an afterlife. But Camus says that the only answer to the absurd universe is to rail against it, to push back against this absurd universe. And Hamlet kind of comes around to that in Act 4, Scene 4, when he says, "My thoughts be bloody or be nothing worth." So we have Hamlet going through this journey of just wondering why is it that he should continue with life, I guess. And he ends up arriving at this "I'm going to take action, and even if it kills me" sort of attitude. And that is akin, it gives a kinship between he and Meursault. So reading intertextually is about finding resonances. It's about how bringing knowledge about one text influences how you interpret another. It can be based on genre, ideas, representations, anything, all right? And it can be deliberate by the author or constructed by the reader. So hopefully that gives you some clarity around intertextuality, but more importantly, how you might be able to draw some linkages between specific texts of Hamlet and Camus' The Outsider. Good luck.